Now I have a great pleasure of introducing a board member of ours who is the president and executive director of the Global Health Council. That's Lois Pace. Lois has an extraordinary career working across countries at the ground level in all kinds of public health endeavors. She holds a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She served previously in quite a number of well-known organizations in different policy capacities, advocacy capacities. These include the Livestrong Foundation, American Cancer Society, Physicians for Human Rights, the Catholic Relief Services. So she's a well-known figure on the path to advocacy and policy change. And we're just delighted that she's agreed to not only continue as our board member, but to moderate this really significant panel. Lois, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. And congratulations to you and Bala on another great year. It's certainly my pleasure to serve on the board with all of you. And it's also my pleasure to be with 30 plus attendees, it looks like, this evening. So I am grateful to be able to kick us off with this conversation, a very important one that we're hoping to have tonight on current events. As Steve mentioned in his opening remarks, we really are at a turning point in this country with our conversation on race and racism. And so thrilled that UNA-NCA has taken up the charge in advancing this conversation. And I think that rightfully this is just one in a series of discussions I know are taking place both formally and informally, not just in our chapter and across our region, but in chapters around the country. And I understand something that UNA USA has really taken hold of as a priority for them as well. So hopefully we can all gain a lot from this discussion tonight with the panel that we have joining me. And with that, I'd invite them to start their videos if they haven't already while I introduce them. First off, we have, in no particular order, Tanya Wellens, who's the president and CEO of the Greater Washington Community Foundation here in DC. We have George Jones, who's also president and CEO of Bread for the City here in Washington. And then finally, we have Una Nelson, who's a student at Howard University, go Bison, and also a UNA-NCA representative to the National Council. So with that, I will make sure everyone is on and then kick us off. Welcome, welcome. Great, terrific. Well, it's happy to have all of you joining us this evening. And for those of you who don't know my style, I like to keep things conversational. I recognize that we're close to the end of everyone's day. We want to keep everyone awake and energized. And so, as Bala said, it would be great if people could go ahead and submit their own questions for me to pose to the panelists. But I think we're just going to get going and see where the conversation takes us. And hopefully we'll hear from you all in the audience joining us shortly. So again, this conversation really is about what we can all do to more fully and meaningfully confront this issue of racism that's bubbling up for us. It isn't the first time, of course, that America has struggled with racism and the sort of consequences or very public aftermath thereof. There have been numerous times in our history where things have, this issue has truly bubbled to the surface, but I think we can count this as one more instance. And so with that in mind, I'm very cognizant of sort of the long arc that this issue has taken, this long road traveled for this particular sort of priority in our country. And so I think with that, I want to have a conversation really keeping in mind the long history of racism and then obviously sort of the long road ahead as a result. But I also want to be sure that we're not just talking at too high a level, that we're not just talking about, say, what the US could do or even what the UN could do. I want to be sure that everyone here, and I'm not just speaking to our panel, but to all of you looking at me now, I want to be sure that this is a conversation about personal action and responsibility. So not just something at the institutional, but the individual level as well. With those caveats or, pieces of my introduction, I think my first question to the panel overall that I'd like each of you to answer is really just kind of how you're feeling in this moment, right? I mean, the entire world now is watching the U.S. grapple quite publicly with the recent police brutality and other acts of violence against Black Americans. You've seen our country rise up. You've seen rallies really take place all over the world. And it's been quite captivating and arguably moving. But I don't want to tip the scales too much with my opinion of what's happening. I'd love to hear what you think. So maybe I'll start with George and work my way back.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, and I'm not the first person to say this, that we are, and in my mind, we are having a moment that is historical. As the play Hamilton says, I think history has its eyes on us as we look to sort of tackle this. And I think this is just the greatest opportunity we've had to address racial inequity and racism since the 1960s. I think that for many of us who are in this space, I've been working in the social justice space for almost 40 years now. This is the moment we've been waiting for. And so I am, to be quite honest with you, quite thrilled and exhilarated about this, what I think is a once in a lifetime opportunity to really do something to move the needle, to put it in a cliche way, around sort of racial justice and racial equity.
Thanks, and Tanya.
Absolutely. I've been calling this the sort of the trifecta of crises. At least we forget that we're in the middle of a global health pandemic, an economic crisis, and a crisis of democracy, all of which have the underpinning of racial inequity and bias. I think there's some things as it relates to the crisis of leadership in all of these that we should absolutely, as a country with the spotlight on us from around the world, be completely embarrassed by. I have lots of friends around the world, and the response that I've received this morning was just that countries like the UK, the Caribbean, many countries in the Caribbean were thinking about sort of banning US travelers, even as they begin to open up. And I think it speaks to the carelessness with which we've treated or responded to the global health pandemic. It also means that we're going to be in the economic crisis for a much longer period of time. But to George's point, were the world not still, and all of these things happening at once, I'm not sure that we'd be able to focus our eyes or be so laser focused, have the time, the attention, the bandwidth to lean in to the cause of social justice and racial equity that we're in right now. So like George, I am hopefully optimistic, a little bit tired because we were working so hard to respond in a timely way to COVID. But I'm energized because I think my role, especially now for our community, is to figure out how we fund the movement, to figure out how we support the movement by moving resources to people who can use them to continue to push the agenda forward.
Great, thanks for that. Una.
So both of you made some pretty great points. Tanya, I want to reiterate what you said about trifecta crises. Just what a play on words right there. It makes me feel like I've been transported back to the times of the Spanish flu, the 1960 civil rights movement, and either the 2007 economic crash or the Great Depression. So we have about 4 major time periods right now in not even half a year. And honestly, it's very overwhelming. I didn't even graduate college yet, and there's already another economic crisis on the way. We hear about or read about in school about the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the riots and the watchdogs and the hoses and the brutality of people just trying to exercise their right to protest. And then right now I'm seeing the same thing happen in real life. So some part of me feels like I'm living in a movie that was curated based on historical fiction. It doesn't seem real. It seems like it was made up in somebody's head. And so for me, I feel overwhelmed. And right now, I'm doing the best I can to learn and absorb all this information that honestly I did not learn in school. You guys have, George, you were saying 40 plus.
Sorry, Una, I think we've lost you. It was so
Years in the
compelling.
social justice service to catch up. Can you hear me now? Wait, am I back?
You're back.
Back, okay, great. I think I left off on how I'm just trying to catch up, making sure I'm as educated as possible during this time, because there's so much they don't tell you in school. And we need to be educated in this time because we can't repeat the same mistakes, or we have to be able to recognize the mistakes that was made in the 1960s, right? Civil rights. We have to be able to call out our government when something's wrong. Why is this being repeated when we just saw this issue not even a couple decades ago? What's missing here? And I think from people around my age, people just graduating college, grad school, I just turned 20, so early 20s, that time where it's so pivotal, where we're able to soak up a lot of information. This time, I really do have hope that this is that pivotal.
Sorry, Una.
But I have to, especially for my generation, read articles, read books, understand who you're voting for in terms of elections. That's super important, and how important local elections are. I encourage my people to vote, and I encourage them to take action more than they have before. We support businesses that are not funding super PACs or corporations or swaying government policy making. That's something you don't think about, but how we spend our dollar has a huge influence in how we live our lives. And that was something where you kind of know in the back of your head, but when I did more research and finding out how the everyday McDonald's or I don't know, Walmart are supporting initiatives or issues that I do not support.
I think that's a really, I mean, Una, I can really appreciate how, you know, I felt like there was a volley that happened where Tanya's like, I'm exhausted but energized, and then boom, here comes Una with all the energy saying, yeah, no, I'm ready to roll. And I can really appreciate the historical context that each of you brought, right? I mean, my mother picked cotton. She integrated her high school. And I turn to her sometimes in these moments and I ask, how are you managing this? How should I manage this? Because you lived through all those things, you know, growing up in Tennessee, my dad's from Alabama, they've seen some things. And you know, this idea that we don't have to be in despair. We can certainly be exhausted because it has been a long road. Yet, you know, there's so much we can learn from the people who traveled this road before us. I think that's a really powerful message. Una, I want to stay with you because we have a question that's come in, and it matches a question similar to what I had, which is, you know, well, who else can teach us in this moment? And I think specifically it's what role could or should the United Nations be playing for the U.S.? I mean, so often we have this kind of question or assumption in reverse that the U.S. has so much to offer the world in terms of democracy or economy or, you know, health, right? And yet here we are facing this very real social or civil crisis. Do you have thoughts, especially given your role as on our National Council, what the United Nations should be doing or saying specifically in light of the statements they've already made, the hearings they've already had? What more do you recommend should be happening between the two?
Okay, thank you for suggesting that. So I was saying how we all know that the U.S. is the UN's biggest supporter financially. And before the UN made its statement, I'm thinking, oh no, is there going to be some kind of bias or hesitancy because they're afraid that the U.S. will pull funding, which they've already done, and they already pulled out of WHO. And so that concerned me. So it really gave me a lot more hope when the Secretary General condemned a lot of the human rights violations in the US. I think we have to understand that the US in particular, yes, you do have a lot of influence at the UN because you do support it financially the most, but you signed up as a member of the UN for an unbiased opinion on how you govern. And we need to take that responsibility seriously, because we're financially supporting the UN because we trust in its entity, we trust in their judgment, and we trust the opinions of what they have to say about not only the US, but amongst the world. And so I think that the UN has every right to condemn the US on a human rights issue, because the US, when they sign up, when they're donating money, they're saying, we are going to accept your opinion if you, in your expertise, if you think that we have some issues to work out in terms of our governance. And I really hope the US kind of takes what the UN has to say greatly under consideration, because now it's not just the citizens speaking up. You have a whole international entity speaking up, an unbiased opinion, an opinion that is supposed to be the voice of human rights and civil rights matters across the globe. And so I think the US really needs to take that seriously and not just think because they support it financially that they have more leeway to kind of push it off or push it to the side. I think what the UN is saying is very important.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate it. Tanya, interested in your thoughts too. I mean, you referenced having friends abroad. What's your take on what the UN should be doing?
Well, it's interesting in thinking about what I could offer. Hold on one quick second. The interesting journey of working at home, lots of kids in your house, so I apologize for that. But when I was preparing my remarks for today, I was thinking back over my career. So I spent most of my career in international development. And as you said, Lois, we were the teacher. And I think now it's the student. When I was a junior in college, I worked in Colombo, Sri Lanka for USAID and their democracy and governance team. And I looked at, human rights abuses, strengthened rule of law, the relationship between the rebel minorities and the rest of the population. I worked as an intern for the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements in 1996, where housing was the global issue of the day. 5 years in post-apartheid South Africa, where we were really looking at how do you build a pipeline of next generation leaders in that country to be able to respond to all of the vestiges of apartheid. 8 years at the World Bank Group on financial inclusion and financial access, particularly looking at how poor people around the world have been locked out of the financial services sector. And then 2 years at Peace Corps on peace, friendship, and locally organized community development. And if you think about all the things that we need to focus on as a country right now, housing, economic justice, free press, sort of the strengthened rule of law, sort of this balance of human rights and human rights issues, sort of the financial access and financial inclusion, peace, friendship, they're all the same things. And it's such an interesting juxtaposition around, again, being the teacher in one period and the student in the other. I think the opportunity is thinking through, our connected struggles, sort of globally, and sort of the return to the principles and ideals that this country was founded on. And the implementation flawed, of course, because it did not include Native or Indigenous or African Americans in the sort of the ideals or the framing. But the framing in and of itself has, I think, a unique opportunity to really live out its core values, its core value. I think there's an opportunity, and if we think about the rise and fall of places, and even in our recent history, we can look at Bosnia, we can look at Rwanda, we can look at South Africa, where things fell apart, but they had to fall apart in order to build them in a way that was more equitable and more just. I think that's the place that we are now. And the international community has to hold us to account in order for us to really, push forward for meaningful change.
Yeah, there's something to be said for building back better. And I keep hearing that term, coming back to the trifecta of issues, right? Like how do we actually build back a health system that can survive a crisis, not just in the US, but worldwide? How do we also, though, apply that to our economy potentially, right? Make it so that people aren't making so little, as Una was alluding to earlier, and her staunch advocacy, so that they're not just sort of paycheck to paycheck,
Not just making
away
it.
from poverty.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then finally with this idea of our social contract too. You're right. It wasn't completely done right, and we've been trying to tinker around the edges for the hundreds of years we've been in existence as a country, whether that's been for women and for people of color, but for indigenous peoples, but really how do we get it right?
Absolutely.
Now we're not back here again in 20, 30 more years. That's it's a really critical question. I appreciate you both of your I'm glad that you and I some things, but I think it's important for people to understand the richness of your experience and how you straddled the two. It's a unique experience, I think, to have both such rich international, not just awareness, but activity, and yet really be as committed as you are to the work that you're doing. I presume the U.S. is your home, but it's your home. Okay.
No,
so you sorry?
It is. Yep.
Okay, great. And so I guess I want to actually ask how you've reconciled that, even just personally, right? There's one question about how the U.S. is thinking about student, teacher, and these roles that it's played over time. But even for you, are you, feeling this disconnect in this moment yourself about your role or experience in the U.S. versus abroad, or is there some sort of natural synergy that you're finding in this moment? I think that could be helpful for others who might be feeling, maybe a bit unsettled, right, by this what seemed like a sudden shift.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have done this straddle of hyper local focus U.S. and then everything in international development is also local. As much as it is global, when you're really doing work, you're doing it at a community level, and the systems that you're trying to impact and affect are all the same systems. It's local government typically, or sometimes provincial government. It's the private sector. It's NGOs, and then it's to some extent philanthropy. These are the same systems that we're trying to move, to advance, to align domestically now. All the work that, and I'm happy to share this panel with George, because if I'm in philanthropy, he runs an important nonprofit. But when I need something done, or I need to check a reference about whether this is the way that philanthropy ought to be moving, I got to call people who have an ear to the ground and who understand really what's happening. At the same time, I'm checking in with our colleagues and our peers in local government to say, we can fund this. This could offer a bit of, catalytic resources that government might pick up to further. So I think that the systems are the same. It is very tricky to stay connected in the international development space and in the local community development space at the same time. I really have not, in the last 4 years, been able to really pay that, close attention. When I was at Peace Corps, I was all in, and the moment I moved from Peace Corps to local community development, my entire focus has had to shift here. But because you understand how these systems work, and because of the unique and unfortunate nature of where we are right now, it is important, one, that the institutions and systems like the World Health Organization that we have had relationships with and been a part of for so many years, that where those things are breaking and falling apart, that we have to really ride this thing out. Those of us who care will return to, an active U.S. participation in diplomatic spaces, because we know how important they are. Like, we're just in a period right now of unfortunate lack of leadership when it comes to sort of the global importance or the global stature of the United States, which is why I think it's all the more important that that the world not let us off easy. They can't let us off easy, because we're just too, the world can't let us off easy. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I can appreciate that. You just I was letting it sit for a little bit. Getting my pen so I can write that down. But George, she called you into this, and I think it is fitting for you to respond to this question of straddling as well. How have you reconciled the two, or how are you viewing this as someone on the front lines? As Tanya was saying, everything global is local, right? All social justice is really happening on the ground, on the front lines, in our communities, in our backyards. So, as you've been a recipient of our Human Rights Award in years past, and so you're, well aware of like the human rights context in which y'all work, and yet you tackle that on a daily basis. Are you heartened by this, recognition that the two are one and the same? Do you have any other insights now that we're in this moment?
Well, I don't think it's going to surprise anybody. I think people know that the challenges that there's a saying about racism in America, we didn't invent it, but we perfected it in this country. And so it isn't unique to us. And in fact, it didn't start in this country. And so I think, yes, the rest of the world has every right to sort of, call America out, because we have sort of, portrayed ourselves as being this beacon of freedom and, equality and justice. And to be honest with you, we've always fallen short of that. And even as one who's only worked domestically, I've always been aware of that. And as one who really has a kind of, like many African Americans have, I suspect, I have a real strong interest in what happens in Africa and what's happened, the kinds of injustices that play themselves out there. So I've always been aware of that. In fact, I've long thought that my last foray into this work would be in Africa, and a chance to sort of get back to the motherland, so to speak. So there's a connection, and there's a legacy of both sort of the evolution of justice in the world that America has been a part of, but unfortunately, the legacy of racism and oppression of people of color and Black people in particular that this country has been a part of. But so has England, and so many countries in the world. And so I hope that those countries who are calling us out, were rightfully so. Also, the truth of the matter about racial equity is that we all have to start at home and talk about what's going on in our own lives, in our own households, and in our own countries, and in our own organizations. At Breath of the City, when we started 8 years ago to look at racism and its place in the work we do in the social justice work, we had to look internally. Almost every system in this country, if not every system in this country, has been socialized to be a racist system. It doesn't matter if it's being led by a Black person or not. The systems that, when people talk about systemic racism, what they're talking about is really the adoption of some version of the original systems that were set up 400 years ago. And we've sort of reformed them to some degree. In the best instances, there's been some reform, but in too many instances, it's just been some transformation of them into something, something that is new and sometimes improved or new and veiled. And so when I think about the domestic work, I think about, like as Tonya said, it's all local, and in a way, it's all local in terms of what's happening in your own institutions. And I think internationally, all the countries, the whole world has to pledge to become an anti-racist planet. We need an anti-racist country and an anti-racist city here in Washington, D.C. And our nonprofits and our philanthropies, and our corporations, and first and foremost, our governments have to understand what it means to be anti-racist and commit to that. And I think that's the journey we're on now. And I think that's the opportunity that's presented itself is that, one of the things I've been saying about here in DC, and I've been really worried about our policymakers here, is I don't think they'll ever have a better opportunity to do the most progressive things they can do. You can only accomplish so much in a finite amount of time, but this is a time when anybody who is looking to build on the dreamer's dream of the 1960s, this is the time to do it, and that there is so much support. I mean, a recent study in DC said that 83% of taxpayers believe that 83% of voters, rather, in DC believe that it is appropriate to increase the taxes for wealthy people in this city. That, that sort of, even in a liberal city like DC, when is a policymaker going to get almost the entire city saying, we're willing to do our share to bring about some kind of economic and social equity? And so that's true in DC. I think it's true in the country. The other thing I want to say, and this is very tangential, but I feel like it's worth saying every time, those people who are on the streets in this country right now in our city are doing the hard, dirty work of political reform, of social reform. It's not pretty, it's ugly work, but if you don't, without that kind of agitation, the 60s wouldn't have had the kind of progress they saw. And this opportunity we have, make no mistake about it, a lot of it is being borne by those people who are willing to literally put their lives on the line to say, we're not moving, we're not stopping until there's some change in this country, in this city, and in our communities.
Amen. Thank you. Back to what you were saying about institutions, I couldn't help but think about the ways also, I think the development community overall, like the international development sort of sector, which includes groups, social justice organizations or institutions, are being criticized for being white-led and or just dominated by groups who don't reflect the communities they serve. And so I didn't want to lose that recommendation, the very poignant one that you made earlier in your remarks, that change does start with us individually. And, I think there's so much goodwill in our community, in our sector, to say, what can we do to help? It's like, well, you can help yourself, right? Like, there's a lot that can be done at home.
That's right.
So I want that to sit with folks. But also, just there's so much you had in what you said, George. And, another piece of this, and it relates to a question we received about intersections, right? Like, and those of us who've been doing this work, y'all who've been doing this work more, robustly than I have, can, I think, speak to the fact that it's often not just a race issue or question, but as we've seen with the COVID crisis and with other issues, it's about race and poverty or race and gender. And so I'd love for each of you to speak to that as well. I think, George, starting with you, really, really tackling this question of intersections. And perhaps, I think the questioner just asked in terms of, speaking openly, but I think specifically, I wonder how you resolve that, or whether there is a, oftentimes I find we're asked to choose, just like we're asked to choose an identity. I think we're also asked to choose, a service priority, which one we tackle first. There isn't enough room to talk about all, Black Lives Matter, and also address like the Poor People's Campaign and advance that agenda. And I think some of us would argue, actually, we can hold both of those glasses of water. But do you have a response in that?
Yeah, and it isn't necessarily the most politically correct one, but I do think it is. I do think that there's something redeeming about my perspective and about many people's perspective, which is that when you focus on race, the intersections that people oftentimes worry about or identify with, whether it be gender or non-conforming gender or poverty, income status, or whether it is any other kind of oppression, that, and you've probably heard this before, that it is multiplied for people of color. And so that's part of the reason why focusing on anti-Black racism is, to some degree, the most most strategic thing to focus on, even if we weren't the most oppressed people, and I guess technically we're not, because certainly Native Americans are more oppressed really in this country. But the bottom line is that if you're going to be effective in moving the social justice needle in this country in particular, but in the world in general, is to focus on anti-Black racism isn't a way to sort of lift all boats, because one, there's an intersection between, so Black gay people and Black gender non-conforming, Black people living in poverty, Black people who, forget that, Black people who are CEOs. I mean, you're going to find that the outcomes for them are going to be worse than any other group who also might be in that sort of subset of identities. And so that's the truth. It is the reason why Bread for the City focuses on that. It's also the reason we focus on it is because only people who live in poverty in DC essentially are people of color, and disproportionately Black people. And so here locally, when you talk about poverty, you talk about oppression, you're really talking about Black people by and large. So that's that. But the other piece of it is that history, and this is just the flip side of it, is that history has shown us that to some degree, sort of to a little bit to my chagrin, is that when more justice is delivered for Black people, or achieved, that probably is a better way to put it, achieved by Black people, that other groups succeed and benefit from that, women in particular, white women in particular. And so, there's a part of me that doesn't begrudge that, because, we all want justice. But I guess my point is, if you are a person who feels oppressed, you should know that when Black people are treated better, everyone gets treated better. That when we fight for justice, when we point out wrongs, when we create new realities in our communities, people benefit in general. And I think history bears that out. It is why it makes sense for there to be a coalition of folks who get behind the anti-Black racism, because I think it will make a difference in the quality of life in this country and in the world in general.
Thanks, George. I appreciate that. Tanya, go ahead.
No, I'm so happy George said it. It's absolutely the case for the United States and globally. Like, this is where these intersections of local, international ring true. If we focus on anti-Black racism globally, then we focus on the cause and the case for all people. And I heard, and I've seen the sign that all lives, when Black lives matter, all lives will matter. And so it's to those same points. George also made a point earlier that I wanted to touch on around sort of the reckoning, hold us to account, the reckoning of the United States, but also the reckoning of what colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade and all of those disruptions did to Black people throughout the diaspora. So that's what I wanted to mention about that. The other thing I want to say that I think makes this conversation so important and significant for me is, for all of the international experiences that I listed, in most of those cases, I was the only one. I was the only one who was participating, chosen, sitting at the table, and I am an African American. My family is 8 generations up from slavery that we've been able to trace back to. So I'm an African American. I'm not from the Caribbean or somewhere far. My parents were enslaved on this soil here. But I got connected to international development because I had a professor who one said, I was a participant in Model United Nations. Again, there are so many things that are full circle for me here. And I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And he said, Tonya, there are lots of lawyers out there. We need more more African Americans to be diplomats and to go into international development. But it was an affirmative action program that USAID had put forth as a pilot in partnership with HBCUs around the country. I'm an Aggie. I went to North Carolina A&T State University. And they worked with 4 HBCUs in the South to choose best and brightest students who had an interest in international development to spend time in 2 USAID missions, one in Sri Lanka, Colombo, Sri Lanka, and the other in Nepal. And I got selected, I got chosen for that. But I'm making the point of, a decision to proactively, affirmatively recruit and identify and create a pipeline for people in spaces where we don't, where we typically aren't, is still an important thing for, for the international development community to pursue. It's just not enough to say, oh, there aren't enough, there aren't that many, we can't find them. Like, those things are so not the truth. We have to be very—
Look at us, here we are.
Absolutely.
You're sitting right
Absolutely.
here.
So again, I'm just here to say and to bear witness that when we turn our attention to inclusion and equity, then you can get the results that you seek. I mean, that I'm living proof of it, very proud of it. And I'm very proud to say that it was an affirmative action program, because I think that word has gotten a bad reputation. But had it not been for that effort, I would have not been introduced to this world of international development that I've spent 20 plus years just loving, enjoying, affecting change, and hoping to return to one day. But it's just important that we not lose sight that the struggles that we're seeing here play themselves out in development spaces unless we do something different.
That's powerful, man, really. And I couldn't agree more. I am also a testament to being plucked out, and my goal is to keep that door open behind me, to make sure we can just fill that pipeline as much as possible. I recognize we're coming up on time. I know Una is actually still with us, just on the phone. So I think I'll start to close things out, starting with her. Really, I have to say I really enjoyed this conversation. It looks like others have as well from the chat box, and I have to apologize I haven't gotten to everyone's questions. I'm glad that people sent in so many. If it makes you feel any better, I didn't get to all my questions either. But I think the last one I have for the panelists is to really offer, it's sort of cliche, right? But it's, what is the real call to action? And specifically, given where we started and where we are, there's UNA-NCA. You have this, group of people who are online and who are really feeling this conversation. The leadership is strong and on board. I think folks are ready to take some sort of action. And I'm mindful that we as Black people don't want to be the teachers all the time of this. Maybe it's a matter of asking if you could wave a magic wand and have one thing change, or one thing that this chapter takes on with regards to this issue of racism. What would it be? Una, can we start with you? Well, I will see if Una can come in with that response, because I know she'd have a fiery one. But I'll take it back to George, and then we'll come back to Tonya.
Well, I tend to give this answer to almost every time. You didn't ask the question exactly the same way, but one of the questions of the day, particularly coming from our white brothers and sisters, is what can I do? And actually the answer that I think for anybody who wants to be a part of racial justice, racial equity, the answer is the same, really, whether you're white or any other identity, which is, first, you need to understand, you need a racial equity analysis. If you haven't had a real full racial equity analysis, it will be difficult to understand and to connect the dots on why so many of the things that we are advocating for, whether it's reparations or affirmative action or housing as a right, or all the things that we're arguing for will make sense. You may not agree with it because it's painful, particularly for white people, to go through the process of understanding how racism has been socialized and we can do. And I think that, and I certainly didn't coin this term, that to some degree we've been asleep. That people are finally woke on this issue, and I think that literally we've been asleep from 1968 to for us at Breath of the City, it was 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed, when we realized, and I was challenged in my own organization to figure out, why is race such a variable and correlation to people who are living in poverty? I mean, we hadn't asked ourselves that question, and everybody in my organization now goes through a racial equity analysis, because what they need to understand is there is an intersection between race and almost every other issue we deal with at Breath of the City, that if you don't understand it, you will be working at cross purposes when you're trying to address this. You'll be doing things like blaming people for where they are and trying to fix them, and thinking that if they just worked a little harder or
things would get better.
All those things. And so, but to understand why those old sort of ideas about why racism persists, you have to go through this. I think first and foremost, you have to go through
That's helpful. Thank you. And I know Una's back on and has some more thoughts on complacency she wanted to share as part of her takeaway. Una, go ahead.
I want to make sure everybody can hear me. Can we hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can. Thank you.
I'm having the worst technical. So sorry, but I'm really loving hearing the conversation. It's been so enlightening and it just got my soul on fire. But yes, I was making sure that in case my mic didn't work, I was typing some things in the chat. I think that, and I'll try to make this brief, that we need to recognize our potential and really educate ourselves and not stay complacent with the status quo. I think that the racially and economically elite take advantage how people like to stay complacent. We all each have a special gift and our own power, and we have to tap into that power in order to do what we need to do to help make the world a better place. Everybody has their own talent, everybody has their own drive, and I think that if we all just tap into that and pour into that, we can all do our part to driving our future forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Nelson. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Tonya, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so hard to come
behind.
It's so hard to come behind Una. I love her energy. And I would just say, get behind smart, high energy people like Una, who will chart the path for us to follow. 1, 2, stay the course. I can bear witness to sort of the surge energy, the surge fundraising. What I'm going to say is that we're going to get a lot done in the immediate term, but we're going to need people to stay with us for the longer term, so that we can really make the transformational changes that we're capable of. And I'd say use your influence and fund the movement. It's really time for us to put our money where our mouth is and get behind people and organizations that are doing the work.
Love it. But I don't have anything else to say except thank you to each of you. I am so grateful that I got to sit on a panel with you. And P.S., I have admired each of you from afar without you knowing it. So I'm glad that I finally get to make your acquaintance and just, blessed to be on this virtual stage sharing this moment with all of you. I've learned and gained a lot, not just in mind, but in heart. So with that, I want to pass things back to our hosts at UNA-NCA and thank Stephen Bala for offering the stage this time for such an incredible discussion. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much to you.
Wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.